The town of Santa Isidora lay in a green valley in southern Portugal, where vineyards climbed the hills in neat rows and white houses shone softly under the sun. It was not a famous place. Travelers rarely stopped there. Trains passed through the nearby station without slowing, and most maps marked the town with letters so small they were easy to miss. But to the people who lived there, Santa Isidora was the whole world. In the mornings, bakers opened their shutters before sunrise. The smell of warm bread drifted into the cobbled streets, while shopkeepers swept dust from their doorsteps. Children crossed the square with satchels bouncing against their backs, and old men gathered beneath the plane trees to discuss weather, politics, and memories from years no one else remembered correctly. Above the town, beyond the terraced vineyards and a narrow dirt road, stood a small chapel built of pale stone. It was called the Chapel of Nossa Senhora de Esperança, Our Lady of Hope. The chapel was old, older than the railway, older than the school, older than nearly every house in the valley. Its bell had once rung every evening, but now it was silent most days. The wooden door had faded from dark brown to gray, and ivy had begun to creep across one wall. Inside, on a simple altar, stood a statue of the Virgin Mary carved long ago from cedar wood. Time had cracked the paint at the edges of her robe. The white had turned cream. The pale blue mantle had grown dull with dust and candle smoke. But her face remained gentle. For many in Santa Isidora, the chapel had become little more than a place passed on feast days or funerals. But one person still climbed the road to it every evening. Her name was Inês Carvalho. She was 17 and lived with her mother and younger brother in a small house near the lower vineyards. Her father had died at sea 4 years earlier when a storm caught the fishing boat he worked on near the coast. Since then, her mother, Teresa, had done her best to keep the family together, sewing clothes for neighbors, tending a tiny garden, and hiding her exhaustion behind a patient smile that fooled almost no one. Inês had grown older very quickly after her father's death. She helped with the house, fetched water, cooked meals, and minded her brother Samuel whenever her mother worked late. Samuel was 11, thin and quiet, with dark curls and a chest that had grown weak over the winter. It had begun as a cough. Then came the fever. Then the breathlessness. Some days he was well enough to sit by the window and read. Other days he could barely rise from bed. The doctor from Avora had visited 3 times. Each visit ended the same way. Medicine, cautious words, and the kind of silence adults used when they wished they had better answers. So Inês turned to the one place that had always made her feel less alone. Every evening, just before sunset, she climbed the dusty road to the chapel and lit a candle before the statue of Mary. Her grandmother had once told her, when she was still small enough to stand on tiptoe to reach the altar rail, "When sorrow becomes too heavy, tell it to the mother. She never rushes anyone away." Inês never forgot that. One evening in early October, the valley was washed in amber light. The vineyards glowed red and gold. A flock of birds crossed the sky above the chapel and disappeared behind the western hill. The air smelled of dry grass, stone, and the first cold hint of autumn. Inês pushed open the chapel door. It gave its usual soft groan. Inside, the room was dim and still. Only 2 candles burned beside the statue. Their flames fluttered slightly in the quiet, and long shadows trembled on the walls. Dust hung in the air like fine silver. She stepped toward the altar, set down her own candle, and struck a match. The flame caught. She knelt. "Please help Samuel," she whispered. Her voice was barely louder than the wick. "I know everyone asked for something. I know maybe there are too many people suffering to count. But he is just a child." She swallowed and looked down at her folded hands. "He tries to smile so Mother won't worry. But I see how tired he is. And I'm afraid." Her throat tightened. "Please don't let him suffer." The chapel remained silent. Outside, wind brushed softly through the cypress trees near the wall. Inês closed her eyes. "If anyone is listening," she whispered, "please." For a long moment, nothing changed. Then the air in the chapel grew strangely warm. Not hot, only gentle, as if the room had taken a slow breath. Inês opened her eyes. The flames of the candles had become perfectly still. A pale glow was forming beside the statue. At first she thought it must be evening light slipping through the small side window. But the glow was too white, too steady. It did not move as sunlight moved. It seemed to gather in the air itself, brightening without glare, soft as mist, and clear as moonlight on water. Her heart began to pound. The glow widened, spilling across the altar and over the cedar folds of the statue's mantle. Then she saw that the statue was no longer alone. A woman stood beside it. She wore a long white robe that fell in quiet folds to the floor, and over it a pale blue mantle rested softly across her shoulders. The light around her was delicate, not blinding, and yet it made every corner of the chapel seem sharper, calmer, more real. Her face was not dazzling. It was tender. That was what struck Inês first. Not grandeur, but tenderness so complete it seemed to quiet every frightened thought in her at once. The woman looked at her and smiled. Inês tried to rise, but her knees felt weak against the stone. For one impossible second she thought she must be dreaming. Then the woman spoke. "Do not be afraid." Her voice was gentle and warm, like someone speaking to a child after a nightmare. Inês felt tears rush to her eyes without warning. "Who are you?" she whispered, though deep inside she already knew. The woman stepped a little closer. The soft light deepened around her. "I heard your prayer," she said. Inês stared at her, trembling. "You heard me?" The woman nodded. "I always hear prayers spoken with love." Inês looked from the woman to the statue beside her. The same white robe, the same pale blue mantle, the same gentle sorrow in the face. Her lips parted. "You're her." The woman did not answer directly. Instead, she placed one hand lightly over her heart and looked at Inês with such kindness that the answer seemed to fill the chapel before words could. "The Virgin Mary," Inês whispered. The woman's expression remained calm. "I am a servant of God's mercy," she said softly. Inês could hardly breathe. "Why did you come here?" Mary turned her gaze briefly toward the chapel door, toward the valley below, the vineyards, the clustered houses, the people hurrying through ordinary evening without knowing what was happening on the hill above them. Then she looked back at Inês. "Because this town has forgotten something precious." Inês frowned through her tears. "What?" Mary's eyes held hers. "Hope." Outside, the sky darkened from gold to rose. Inside the chapel, the light remained. And in that quiet moment, with the cypress shadows stretching long across the wall, Inês understood that the life she had known until then had just ended. Something had begun, and soon, all of Santa Isidora would feel it. Inês remained kneeling on the stone floor of the chapel, her eyes fixed on the woman standing beside the statue. The glow surrounding her was soft and calm, like moonlight resting on quiet water. It did not hurt Inês's eyes. Instead, it seemed to fill the small chapel with a gentle warmth that pushed away every shadow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind moved quietly through the cypress trees near the wall. The last colors of sunset faded from gold to deep violet beyond the chapel window. Inês finally found her voice. "Why did you come here?" she asked softly. The woman looked toward the valley below, where the lights of Santa Isidora were beginning to appear one by one in the gathering darkness. "I come where I am called," she said gently. Inês wiped the tears from her cheeks. "But many people pray," she said. "Why here?" The woman turned back toward her. "Because hope is fading in this place." Inês lowered her eyes. She knew that was true. Over the past few years, the town had changed. Many young people had moved away to larger cities. Farms had closed. Shops in the square now stood empty more often than open. Even the church that had once been full on Sundays now held only a handful of people. Her mother sometimes said the town had grown tired. For a moment the woman was silent. Then she stepped closer. "You prayed not only for yourself," she said. Inês looked up again. "You prayed for your brother." Inês nodded slowly. "Samuel is very sick." The woman's eyes softened. "Many people carry suffering quietly," she said. Fear tightened in Inês's chest. "Will he be all right?" she asked. The woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she placed her hand lightly on Inês's shoulder. The warmth of that touch moved gently through her like sunlight. "Fear grows when people believe they are alone," she said. Inês frowned slightly. "That doesn't answer my question." A faint smile appeared on the woman's face. "Some answers come with time," she replied. Inês sighed. "But I don't want time," she whispered. "I want him to be healthy." The woman turned her gaze toward the chapel door. "This town once prayed together," she said quietly. Inês remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell about the chapel being filled with villagers every evening long ago. Now it was almost always empty. "People stopped believing," Inês said. The woman shook her head gently. No, she replied. They stopped remembering. Inês was not sure she understood. What should I do? She asked. The woman's eyes became calm and steady. Tell them what you saw tonight. Inés's heart jumped. They won't believe me. They do not need to believe, the woman said softly. They only need to remember hope. Inés looked down at the stone floor. I'm afraid they'll laugh. The woman's voice grew even softer. Courage is not the absence of fear. Those words seemed to settle deeply inside Inés's heart. Just then the light around the woman began to fade slightly. Inés's breath caught. Wait, she said quickly. Will I see you again? The woman glanced toward the statue beside them. You will not be alone. The glow slowly faded. Within seconds the chapel returned to its quiet candlelight. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood alone once more. Inés remained still for several moments, trying to understand what had just happened. Finally she stood. Her candle was still burning beside the statue. Everything looked normal again. But inside her heart, something had changed forever. She hurried down the dusty path toward the town. Night had fallen over Santa Isidora, and warm yellow lights glowed in the windows of the houses. When Inés pushed open the door of her home, she stopped in surprise. Her mother and Samuel were both awake. Samuel was sitting upright in bed, for the first time in days. Inés, her mother said quietly. Something strange happened tonight. She rushed toward them. What do you mean? Samuel smiled weakly. There was a lady here, he said. Inés felt her breath catch. A lady? He nodded. She wore white and blue. Inés's heart began to race. What did she say? Samuel thought for a moment. She told me not to be afraid. Her mother shook her head slowly. I thought he was dreaming, she said. But his fever disappeared. Inés sat beside her brother and held his hand. What else did she say? She asked softly. Samuel looked toward the window. That the town would see the light. The next morning something even stranger happened. Just before sunrise, a shepherd named Rui Almeida was guiding his sheep across the hills above the valley when he noticed a glow above the chapel. At first he thought it was lightning, but the sky was perfectly clear. The light hovered above the chapel bell tower like a pale star. Rui stopped walking. He stared at the hill. Within minutes 2 farmers working in nearby vineyards saw it too. The light remained for nearly a full minute before fading into the brightening sky. By the time the sun rose over Santa Isidora, half the town was talking about the strange glow above the chapel. Some said it was a reflection from the clouds. Others insisted it must have been morning mist. But that evening, when Inés returned to the chapel, she noticed something she had not expected. The wooden doors were already open, and people were inside. Word had spread, and the people of Santa Isidora were about to witness something they would never forget. By the time the sun began to set over Santa Isidora, the narrow road that climbed the hill to the chapel was filled with people. Villagers walked slowly among the olive trees, speaking in quiet voices as they climbed. Some came because they were curious. Others came because they had heard about the strange light that had appeared above the chapel that morning. And some came because, deep in their hearts, they hoped the stories might be true. The chapel of Nossa Senhora de Esperança had not seen so many visitors in years. Inside, the small room filled quickly. Candles burned along the altar, casting warm light across the old stone walls. Wooden pews creaked softly as villagers sat or stood near the back of the chapel. Women held rosaries tightly between their fingers. Men removed their hats. Children whispered questions that their parents could not answer. Near the altar stood Father Antonio, the elderly priest of Santa Isidora. He had served the village for more than 30 years, but even he seemed unsure about what might happen that evening. At the front of the chapel, Inés knelt once again beside the statue of the Virgin Mary. Her heart was beating quickly. She had told no one about the woman she had seen the night before. Yet somehow the entire village had come, as if something had quietly called them. Near the doorway stood Manuel Pereira, the owner of the small grocery store in the town square. Manuel was known as a practical man who trusted only what he could see with his own eyes. This is foolishness, he whispered to the farmer beside him. A strange light appears, and suddenly everyone believes heaven has come to visit us. The farmer shrugged. Then why did you come? Manuel had no answer. The last rays of sunlight slipped through the narrow chapel windows and stretched across the floor. Then the candles flickered. At first no one noticed, but suddenly the air inside the chapel felt warmer. Inés slowly lifted her head. The same warmth she had felt the night before had returned. Then a soft glow began to form beside the statue. The whispering voices faded. One by one, the villagers turned toward the altar. The light grew brighter, soft, golden, and within that light, a figure appeared. Gasps filled the chapel. A woman stood beside the statue. She wore a long white robe that shimmered gently in the candlelight. A pale blue mantle rested over her shoulders and moved softly, as if touched by a breeze that no one else could feel. Her face was calm, peaceful, kind in a way that made several people begin to cry before she even spoke. Inês lowered her head slightly. She recognized that presence immediately, but the villagers behind her stood frozen with disbelief. Manuel Pereira stared with wide eyes. "That's impossible," he whispered. No one moved. The woman looked slowly across the room. Her eyes passed gently over every face. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, yet every person in the chapel heard it clearly. "Do not be afraid." The words settled over the crowd like a quiet wave. An elderly man slowly crossed himself. A young mother near the front began to cry while holding her baby. Father Antonio slowly sank to one knee. The woman stepped forward. "I have come because this village has forgotten something precious," she said gently. Her gaze moved across the villagers. "You have forgotten that love grows stronger when it is shared." Manuel shook his head slowly. "This cannot be real," he muttered. But his voice no longer sounded confident. The woman's eyes moved toward the back pews. They stopped on an elderly woman sitting beside her daughter. Her name was Dona Rosa Fernandez. For many years Rosa had suffered from severe pain in her legs. Walking had become almost impossible. Now she stared at the glowing figure with tears running down her face. "Why are you looking at me?" Rosa whispered. The woman walked slowly toward her. The entire chapel watched in silence. She knelt beside Rosa. "You have carried pain for a long time," she said softly. Rosa nodded. "Yes." The woman gently placed her hand over Rosa's hands. "Your faith has not been forgotten." For several seconds nothing happened. The chapel remained silent except for the faint crackling of candle flames. Then Rosa suddenly gasped. Her daughter grabbed her arm. Slowly, Rosa stood. At first she looked confused. She took one small step forward. Then another. I can stand," she whispered. The chapel filled with cries and prayers. Rosa took another step. Then another. The pain that had followed her for years was gone. "It's gone," she said, trembling. "The pain is gone." The woman in white slowly stood again. But the light around her was already beginning to fade. Inês lifted her head quickly. "Wait," she said softly. The woman turned toward her. "Remember what I told you," she said gently. "Hope must be shared." The glow faded. Within seconds the chapel returned to its quiet candlelight. The woman was gone. For a moment the entire chapel remained silent. Then voices filled the room. People prayed. Others cried openly. Father Antonio covered his face with his hands, and Manuel Pereira slowly fell to his knees. But outside the chapel, something else had already begun. Someone in the nearby city had heard about the strange light above the hill, and by morning, a journalist would arrive in Santa Isidora, determined to discover the truth behind the miracle. By sunrise the next morning, Santa Isidora was no longer the quiet town it had been only days before. Word about the strange events at the hilltop chapel had traveled far beyond the valley. Cars began arriving along the narrow road leading into the village. Some carried visitors from nearby towns. Others came from much farther away. People stepped out with curious faces. Some brought cameras. Some carried rosaries. Others came simply because they had heard the word miracle. Among them was a journalist named Ricardo Mendez. Ricardo worked for a newspaper in Lisbon and had spent years investigating unusual stories, mysterious lights, strange healings, and supposed miracles. Most of the time, he eventually discovered a simple explanation: rumors, coincidences, or people who simply wanted attention. As Ricardo stepped out of his car at the base of the hill leading to the chapel, he fully expected this story to be the same. He grabbed his camera and notebook and began walking up the dusty path. A crowd had already gathered near the chapel. Villagers stood in small groups, speaking excitedly. Some prayed quietly. Others simply waited. Ricardo approached a group near the chapel steps. "I'm a reporter," he said politely. "I heard something unusual happened here last night." Several villagers nodded immediately. "A woman appeared," one man said. "Inside the chapel," another added. Ricardo wrote quickly in his notebook. And you believe it was the Virgin Mary? The man shrugged. What else could it be? Ricardo raised an eyebrow. He had heard that answer many times before. Then someone pointed toward the chapel entrance. That's Dona Rosa, a woman whispered. Ricardo turned. Rosa Fernandez stood near the doorway speaking with several neighbors. Ricardo approached her. I'm told something remarkable happened to you last night, he said. Rosa looked at him calmly. It did. You couldn't walk before? For many years, she replied. Ricardo glanced down at her legs. And today? Rosa slowly stepped down from the chapel steps. One step, then another. Her movements were steady, confident. No pain, she said quietly. Ricardo stared at her for a moment. He had interviewed many people who believed they had experienced miracles. But Rosa did not look confused. She looked certain. Still, Ricardo remained skeptical. Sometimes strong emotions can make people feel temporarily better, he said carefully. Rosa smiled gently. You may believe whatever you wish. Then she turned back toward the chapel. Throughout the afternoon, the crowd continued to grow. By sunset, nearly 300 people had gathered around the small building. Some knelt in the courtyard praying. Others stood quietly watching the chapel doors. Ricardo stayed. Part of him expected nothing more to happen. But another part of him felt something he could not explain. Curiosity. Just before the sun disappeared behind the vineyards, Inês arrived once again. The villagers stepped aside as she walked toward the chapel. Ricardo watched her carefully. Inside, the chapel slowly filled again. Candles flickered beside the altar. The old statue of the Virgin Mary stood quietly in the same place it had always been. Inês knelt near the front. Everyone waited. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Ricardo checked his watch. Then suddenly, the candles flickered. A murmur spread through the room. Ricardo lifted his head. The air inside the chapel grew warm. The glow appeared again beside the statue. Soft at first, then brighter. The room fell completely silent. Ricardo slowly raised his camera. But when the figure appeared beside the statue, his hands began to tremble. The same woman. White robe. Blue mantle. Calm. Peaceful. No one moved. The woman looked slowly across the room. Her eyes rested briefly on Ricardo. In that moment, he felt something unexpected. Not fear. Not confusion. Something deeper. A quiet calm. The woman spoke. People search the world for signs, she said gently. Her voice filled the chapel. But the greatest sign has always been love. Several people began to cry softly. Others bowed their heads. She continued. Care for one another. Forgive one another. And never lose hope. Her eyes moved slowly across the villagers. Then the light around her began to fade. Before disappearing completely, she looked toward Inês. Thank you for listening, she said softly. And then she was gone. The chapel returned to silence. Ricardo slowly lowered his camera. For the first time in his career, he had no explanation. He stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sun was setting behind the hills of Santa Isidora. People spoke quietly about what they had seen. Some prayed. Others cried. Ricardo stood alone near the chapel wall, staring back at the small building. He knew the story would soon travel far beyond the valley. Across the country. Perhaps even across the world. But what stayed with him most was not the mystery. It was the feeling he had experienced when the woman looked at him. A calm he had not felt in many years. As the chapel bell rang softly across the valley that evening, the people of Santa Isidora slowly began to understand something they had almost forgotten. Miracles are not always meant to prove something. Sometimes they exist for only one reason. To remind people that hope still lives. And on a quiet hill above the town, hope had returned.